بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين وحبيب رب العالمين. Let's make our intentions sincerely for the sake of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Abu al-Abbas Ahmad Ibn Taymiyah was born in 661 after Hijrah. This is in the 12th century CE, in the Common Era. He was born in what is in Turkey today, Harran. So in southern Turkey. He was born there, and then his family had to move because the Mongols had attacked at that time. And subhanallah, they were one of the greatest catastrophes of that time for the Muslim nation, where they killed almost 1 million people or more. This is what is said to be recorded in history, that they killed about 1 million people, indiscriminately, men, women, children. And they burned everything to the ground. Anything they saw, they burned to the ground. Houses, libraries, factories of the time, mills, everything they burned to the ground. Even the books they burned, some of them, and others they pelted into the Tigris River. And it's mentioned that so many books were pelted into the river that the color of the water changed because of the amount of ink that there was now in the river. Others mentioned that it became like a bridge from one end to the other of the river. It became like a bridge because there were so many books. So Ibn Taymiyah was born in Harran, in Turkey, and what I'm talking about with regards to the Tigris is in Baghdad. So they attacked all of these areas. And so because of this, they moved to Damascus. They moved to Syria. And his father was actually a person whom the scholars loved, but his father himself, Ibn Taymiyah's father, was not a scholar. His great-grandfather was, al-Majd is what he was known as. And so because of this, because of his grandfather, Ibn Taymiyah's father himself was honored, and he was given errands to run, certain tasks by the scholars and by the Islamic government at that time also. And then when his father passed away, as an honor to his father and his grandfather, they passed on these tasks, these posts, these different posts to Ibn Taymiyah himself. And then Ibn Taymiyah, on top of this, he started to use this as a platform to do other things. And so he began to mention what he knew of religious knowledge. And he made certain statements, as is going to be clear soon, that at first the scholars thought that these are just because he's not a scholar. He's making these statements that are incorrect, but he's not understanding them. So we're going to think well of him, and we're going to rectify him and say that this is not correct, so don't use these words, and we'll just leave it at that. But it kept occurring again and again and again. So at the beginning, when he was talking in open gatherings, he was given this platform to do that. When he was doing that, then at that time the scholars, some of them, who didn't know about his situation, praised him. Even after he died, even after everything that we're going to mention happened, he was still praised by some of the scholars because they didn't know about his situation. They followed strictly the doctrine which says that you think well of another Muslim, which is great. They thought well of a Muslim, or who they thought to be a Muslim, and that was that. So they said, Rahimahullah. They said, when they heard that he was someone who authored many books, they said, radiyallahu anhu. They might have said, jazahullahu khairan. But that itself is not a proof. That itself is not a proof. If we hear about a person who's working to propagate the religious knowledge, we would say about him, MashaAllah, may Allah grant him success. Or jazahullahu khairan. It might turn out that later on, he's a Qadiani. Then of course, we would not be supporting such a person, okay? So that can't be used against us, that we said about him, may Allah make him successful in his endeavors. May Allah accept his deeds. We can't be blamed for that because we just thought well of him. Later on, it transpired that his situation was different to what we had thought it to be. So, among the scholars that praised him were al-Firkah, likewise al-Qazwini, and al-Zamalkani, and many others that praised him at that time. Then, when Ibn Taymiyah, and the reason why I'm mentioning Ibn Taymiyah today is because a lot of, or most of the verdicts, the religious verdicts that the Wahhabiyyah give, that the so-called Salafiyah give, so-called Ahlul Hadith, and so on, they are based upon the doctrine of Ibn Taymiyah. It is as though they take the sayings of Ibn Taymiyah as revelation. So let us explore the history of the life of Ibn Taymiyah and what he went through and the different stages at which the scholars called him out and exposed him and threatened him. But subhanallah, Allah had eternally willed that such a person would have followers who would seek to spread the ill that he taught until nowadays, even until nowadays. It took for it to get to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab some 200 years ago, to get the books of Ibn Taymiyah and follow them exactly as they are and to spread them. And today, because of this type of propagation, because of this effort, unfortunately, we have the Islamic University of Al-Madinah, which is a Wahhabi university, and Jami'at al-Qura, the university in Mecca, which is a Wahhabi university. Likewise, other universities, which it has been said that about 80,000 students altogether graduate every year. What are they taught? These principles, the principles that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab taught, that he took from Ibn Taymiyah and others after Ibn Taymiyah. So when Ibn Taymiyah became popular and when he authored a lot of books and his followers became great in number, al-Hafiz al-Faqih, Wahhaabiyyah al-Iraaqi mentions about this situation in his book al-Ajwibat al-Mardiyah ala al-As'ilati al-Makkiyah. He said, "Ilmuhu akbar min aqli." His knowledge, or the amount of knowledge that he had memorized, was bigger than his mind. And then he mentioned that Ibn Taymiyah went against the consensus of the Muslims in issues, so not even creedal issues, those are going to come later, but in fiqh issues that are about 60 issues. Can you imagine a scholar going against the other scholars' consensus in one issue? This is about 60 issues. So at the time, the scholars, they did not fall short. At the time, the scholars, like the Mujtahid scholar, as-Subki, the father, there are two Subkis. There is the father, Ali ibn Abdul Kafi, as-Subki, and then there is the son, Taqiyy-ud-Deen as-Subki. Both of them were scholars. The father had a higher rank in terms of scholarship. He was a mujtahid, like a Shafi'i. This is Taqiyy-ud-Deen as-Subki. Taqiyy-ud-Deen as-Subki he said, أما بعد فإنه لما أحدث ابن تيمية ما أحدث في أصول العقائد. When Ibn Taymiyah innovated whatever he innovated in the core matters of belief, ونقض من دعائم الإسلام الأركان والمعاقد, and he destroyed the pillars of al-Islam that were holding, let's say, the religious belief up. When he did that, بعد أن كان متسترا بتبعية الكتاب والسنة, after he had been hiding under the premise of following the Quran and the Sunnah, مظهرا أنه داع إلى الحق هاد إلى الجنة, making apparent that he is someone who guides to paradise and is someone who's calling to the truth. What happens? فخرج عن الاتباع إلى الابتداع. He stopped following. He stopped following the Salaf and he started innovating. وشذ عن جماعة المسلمين بمخالفة الإجماع. And he went against the opinions of the Muslims by going against the consensus. وقال بما يقتضي الجسمية والتركيب في الذات المقدس. And he started to say things that necessitated that Allah would have a shape and a size. And he started to say وأن الافتقار إلى الجزء ليس بمحال, which means that he is saying that Allah, it's not impossible that he would be compound. Remember who's saying this? A mujtahid scholar who is recognized in the East and the West. Taqiyy-ud-Deen as-Subki. You must have heard as-Subki before. As-Subki, a very well-renowned scholar. So he commented further. He said, وَقَالَ بِحُلُولِ الْحَوَادِثِ بِذَاتِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And he attributed created attributes to Allah. وأن القرآن محدث تكلم الله به بعد أن لم يكن. And he claimed that the Quran is the speech of Allah. He claimed that it is created and it was after not being. Meaning that he claimed that the Quran has, that the speech of Allah started. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. وأنه يتكلم ويسكت ويحدث في ذاته الإرادات بحسب المخلوقات, and that he claimed, Ibn Taymiyah claimed, that Allah speaks and then falls silent, which is kufur. Because Allah is always powerful, Allah is always speaking, Allah is always alive. So he claimed that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, Ibn Taymiyah claimed that Allah speaks and then falls silent. وتعدى في ذلك إلى التزام قدم العالم. And this leads to saying that the universe is eternal. والتزامه بالقول بأنه لا أول للمخلوقات فقال بحوادث لا أول لها. And this also leads to saying that the different types of creations also don't have a beginning. فأثبت الصفة القديمة حادثة والمخلوق الحادث قديما. And by this he claimed that Allah, who is eternal and everlasting, he claimed Allah to have a beginning. And he claimed the creation, which has a beginning, to be without a beginning. وَلَمْ يَجْمَعْ أَحَدٌ هَذَيْنِ الْقَوْلَيْنِ فِي مِلَّةٍ مِنَ الْمِلَلِ وَلَا نِحْلَةٍ مِنَ النِّحَلِ. And nobody ever said both of them. He said, فَلَمْ يَدْخُلْ فِي فِرْقَةٍ مِنَ الْفِرَقِ الثَّلَاثِ وَالسَّبْعِينَ الَّتِي افترقت عليها الأمة. And so he does not even fall into one of the 73 sects that the Prophet mentioned, alayhi salatu wassalam, that claim to be Muslims. He doesn't fall into any of those because the scholars like Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi and al-Isfarayini, they wrote books in which they clarified who the 73 are. 20 from the Mu'tazila, 20 from the Rafidah, 20 from the Mushabbiha, some Murji'ah, and then finally the 73rd sect, which is al-Firqatul Najiyah, Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. They clarified this. And so this scholar, as-Subki, said that Ibn Taymiyah doesn't fall under any of these. He doesn't fall. Meaning there were some sects that the Muslims said, well, these people, they claim to be Muslims, so they are Islamic. They're not Muslims, but they claim to be Muslims. So because of that, we'll call them Islamic, because being Islamic doesn't mean you're Muslim. It means you attribute yourself to Islam. Like we say, the Islamic University of Al-Madinah. Right? We don't need to say the so-called Islamic. No, the Islamic, because it is Islami, even in Arabic. Right? They attribute themselves to al-Islam. So, Ibn Taymiyah, so there were some sects that the scholars mentioned when we studied. Our teachers even said that there are some sects that are so far from the Islamic belief that the scholars didn't even consider them to be Islamic. So they said they're kufar. They're just straight kufar. So he said, ولا وقفت به مع أمة من الأمم همة وكل ذلك وإن كان كفرا شنيعا مما نقل جملته بالنسبة لما أحدث في الفروع. That he said all of this, despite it being kufur, Taqiyy-ud-Deen as-Subki said, all of this, despite it being kufur, it's like nothing in terms of numbers compared to what he innovated in creed, in furu', in fiqh. A summary of the life of Ibn Taymiyah. Okay, so Ibn Taymiyah, his name was Abu al-Abbas. This is his title, his kunya, Abu al-Abbas. His name was Ahmad Ibn Abd al-Halim, which is his father, Abdul Halim, and his grandfather was al-Majd Ibn Taymiyah. Taymiyah, some scholars said it refers to his grandmother. His grandmother. This is what some scholars say. So he was born in Harran in the year 661 after Hijrah. So in terms of your timeline, your mental timeline that I've told you a few times to have, he falls after. Actually, I'll ask you, what's that event that I always tell you to put in your timeline, your Islamic timeline, the mental Islamic timeline, 555. What happened in 555? See, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala made it so easy. 555, not even 556 or 554. 555. What happened in 555? Subhanallah. Al-Imam Ahmad al-Rifa'i. There you go. Oh, now you know after I said it all. Okay, fair enough. What happened in 555? Not that he was born or that he passed away, he was already born and he didn't die yet. Radiallahu anhu, he kissed the hand of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. When did that happen? 555. Even if you don't write it down. 555. Okay? So here, Ibn Taymiyah was born in 661. Okay? So this is after the death of Shaykh Ahmad, Imam Ahmad al-Rifa'i, after Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, radiyallahu anhuma. And he died in 728. So this is around the 12th and 13th century. He lived around the 12th and the 13th century. So after 1140, from about 1140 to the early 1200s. Okay? This is when Ibn Taymiyah lived. So after 1066, just after 1066 by 1 century. So, Ibn Taymiyah, we said because of the Mongols attacking Harran and that area of Turkey, then they later on went to Baghdad and the Levant towards the east. They moved. They migrated from there and they moved to Sham, the Levant, Syria.
Why do you refer to Ibn Taymiyah when his father was called something else but his grandfather?
It's just how it was known. So some scholars are like that. Like for example, Ahmad Ibn Hanbal, right? His father's name wasn't Hanbal, it was his grandfather. It's just how they're known in the society. So his grandfather might have been more famous, for example, or more popular or more known. And they started off calling him like that, so then it's carried on through history.
But his father was called Ibn Taymiyah.
I don't know. But I mean, his father had his own name, but his father wasn't as famous. Like for example, Genghis Khan, what was his name? Genghis. No, what was Genghis? People don't know his real name. What was his name? Yeah, why was he famous for Genghis Khan? For whatever reason, his name was Temujin. As an example, okay? Because there will be reasons in history, there are different reasons why people are known for certain things. So he was known as Ibn Taymiyah. Yeah? And some people say Ibn Taymiyah, which linguistically, that's their opinion, fine. But we know him to be Ibn Taymiyah. It's not a big issue, you don't need to go to war over Ibn Taymiyah. Ibn Taymiyah.
And when you say 555, you mean after Hijrah?
Yeah, after Hijrah. Because in the Common Era, the Prophet والسلام, would he had just been he wasn't even born then. He was born in 570 CE. Yeah, so we mean after Hijrah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, he once spoke in the year 698. I'll make this a summary, okay? But this you can find in ad-Durar al-Kamina by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. He and other scholars, they wrote out the biographies, or not even specifically Ibn Taymiyyah, they wrote out history, what happened in history. So they mention all this in a lot more detail than I'm going to mention now. So al-Fatwa al-Hamawiyyah, he spoke once about the attributes of Allah in a way that was derogatory, in a way that was not acceptable. Okay, you can imagine the types of things that he said, taking the verses literally and so on, that are related to the attributes of Allah. So in the year 698, the scholars rose up against him. And then, 7 years later, in 705, he was taken to Egypt. And in Cairo, he was actually locked up. So obviously, I'm missing many details. I'm going to read one account later about how they stood up against him. They had all the scholars out, and he was in shackles. And they asked him, "Why did you say, or did you say, or how?" And so on. They asked him to explain. So all of this is going on. It's not just like, he got called to the office. Like, when a child kicks another child and you call them to the office. And it wasn't like that. It was a whole thing. So he was, they had him taken to Egypt and they locked him up in Cairo. After that, he was taken from Cairo to Alexandria, which is in the north of Egypt. So he was taken north. Okay. This was 4 years later, in 709. Then he was returned to Cairo. And because he'd been spreading a lot of these things in his gatherings in Damascus, so the Islamic Empire was connected in the Abbasid period. It was connected, so, like, for example, we'll do a certain topic, we'll do a certain topic in a Jumu'ah. In our other centers, we'll do the same topic all around the world. Right? If you didn't know that, then that's how it is. It's not like when I give the lesson at the end of Jumu'ah, it's not one that I pick. It's one that we're told to do, and we're given it in Arabic and in English. Sometimes it's translated to different languages. It's synchronized. Okay, it's organized. So what happened was that when they locked him up and they saw how dangerous he was, they sent, and it's here as well. Actually, I might read it to you. They had an official document compiled and they sent it to everywhere in the Islamic Caliphate. So in Damascus, they read it out and they said, "Man ya'taqada aqidat ibn Taymiyah halla damuhu." Whoever believes the belief of Ibn Taymiyah, then he is a non-Muslim. In that time, they said, "Halla damuhu," his dam is halal. His blood is halal. He's become an apostate. وَمَالُهُ خُصُوصًا لِلْحَنَابِلَةِ. And likewise his belongings. His belongings are not his belongings anymore because he's a non-Muslim now. He's an apostate now. Especially, and they push down hard on those people that claim to be Hanbalis. Because remember, I don't know if I mentioned it in this lesson, but the Hanbalis were split into two. The scholars referred to them as Fudala al-Hanabila and Mujassimat al-Hanabila. The Hanbalis, a lot of them went off track, and So the scholars refer to the Sunni Hanbalis as Fudala, Ashab al-Fadl, those that have fadl and honor and have a high status. So they call them Fudala al-Hanabila, meaning the Muslims, the Sunni Hanbalis. And those that attribute themselves to Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but they're actually mujassima. They're actually people who attribute Allah with body shape and size. So they said, especially to the Hanbalis who were mujassima, non-Muslims. Then after this, on the night of Eid al-Fitr, and there were people that were following him and protesting. On the night of Eid al-Fitr, in 719, so we've gone from him being imprisoned in 705 all the way now to 719. A lot of activity, okay, going to Cairo, then Iskandariya, then back to Al-Qahira. Then he, on the night of Eid al-Fitr, he was imprisoned in a well. This is how they would imprison people. You know, like nowadays in prison, they might give a person, they might seclude a person into solitary confinement. In the past, they used to do it in a well that had dried up. So they put the person down in a well, then they just leave him there with a guard at the top. So this was on the night of Eid al-Fitr. Then he was taken to a tower. And he was locked there. And then it's related that he even confessed, I am an Ash'ari. When things got desperate, he said, Ana Ash'ariyun. And obviously he hated the Ash'aris. So when things got desperate, he said, Ana Ash'ari. And all this is documented. Okay, this is just a summary that I'm giving you. Then he was taken to Damascus, and in the year, actually, now we're up to 719. We're up to 719 now. He was set free again because of pressure from some of his followers. He was set free. And there are things that I'm missing here. There are many occasions where the scholars of the four schools, they gathered together. There were large gatherings. They had him in shackles. And they would write on the official piece of paper that you agree, read this out, that you agree that what you were saying in the past was kufr and it was impermissible, and now you are upon the creed of, for example, al-Ash'ari, and you believe X, Y, and Z, and you say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. So he would. And then some narrations have it that 2 weeks later he'd be found again in one of his gatherings saying the same thing. So they'd shackle him up again and take him again, and like this, in and out, in and out. Then in 719, Mas'alatul Talaq, he started to bring about this matter of divorce. Now here, I don't remember which case exactly it was about talaq, because there are two things that he said, at least, that were invalid about talaq. One, we're going to see about al-halif. If someone says to his wife, if you go out now, then you are divorced 3 times. So Ibn Taymiyah said that, and he's the only one to say this, he said that this does not count as a divorce. And there's another occasion on which he said, quite regularly actually, that if someone says to his wife, quote, you are divorced 3 times, end quote, then he said this counts as 1. And no one before him had said this. Okay? So this occurred in 719, and he was in prison for 2 years. Then in 726, Mas'alatul Ziyarah, he said that intending to visit the grave of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, he said that this is a travel, if it's traveling distance, it is a travel, he claimed, in which you are not allowed to shorten the prayer. What that means is if you break it up, the scholars said you're not allowed, or some scholars, they said you're not allowed to shorten the 4 rak'ah prayer to 2 rak'ahs if it's a sinful travel. Otherwise you can. Which means he considered traveling with the intention of going to the grave of the Prophet ﷺ to be a sinful travel. So no one said that before him. Okay, so because of this, he was imprisoned in 726 for 2 years until he died. For 2 years until he died. And this is a summary of his life. This is a summary of his life. Something that is very scary also and spine-chilling is that once he was imprisoned and he was brought before the Qadi, before the judge. And the judge said to him, "We've heard that you've been in such and such city in the past week." He said, "No, I've been here I've been locked away here." And then when they pressed him on it, they said, "But such and such person, there are eyewitness accounts of you being in such and such city, far away from here." He said, "Oh yes, if you want to push me, fine." He said, "I have a friend among the jinn." This is recorded. The Wahhabis will tell you about this today as well. Recorded on video. That they will tell you about this. That he said that, I had a friend among the jinn who sometimes takes my form, and it was probably him. It was probably him who took my form and gave that gathering over there. In other gatherings, Ibn Taymiyah said, كَانَ لَنَا صَدِيقٌ مِنَ الْجِنِّ. I used to have a friend among the jinn. كَانَ يُحِبُّنَا. He used to love us. He used to like me. And he would appear sometimes, and he would say things on my tongue, and people would think it's me. But the jinn, لا إله إلا الله, من أكذب خلق الله, they are the majority of them are the biggest of liars. So sometimes you would think, subhanallah, Ibn Taymiyah, some of the things that he said, could a man who is in his right mind actually say them? But then there are things in his works and things that he's actually said, right? That we know it to have been him, but it just shows that, subhanAllah, some of the things that he said, or that it was claimed that he said, it seems that only the shayateen could have thought of things like that. Really, really sends chills down your spine, subhanAllah. Anyway, so just on that note, before we mention some of the cases, al-Rahhala ibn Batuta, the famous traveler, who was a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyah, he was somebody who witnessed Ibn Taymiyah while he was in Damascus. So, Ibn Batuta started off in Morocco, Tanja, with the intention to go to Al-Hajj. And he ended up going to India and many other places, China even. He remained there. He was even made an Islamic judge in this time, in the Abbasid period. And he witnessed Ibn Taymiyah. Now, before we start, the Wahhabis today, they say that this, which is recorded in Ibn Batuta's book, so it's very thick, it's like 700 pages, right? And the reason why I had this book is when I was learning Arabic, I was told that this is good for description. It describes buildings. It's really good. It's really good. So in this book, he mentions that he went to Damascus. And I'll read it actually. When he got to Damascus, he said, وَكَانَ بِدِمَشْقَ مِنْ كِبَارِ فُقَهَاءِ الْحَنَابِلَةِ Taqiyy-ud-Deen ibn Taymiyah Kabir al-Sham. He said, when I got to Damascus, or rather in Damascus, there was a big scholar among the scholars of the Hanbalis called Taqiyy-ud-Deen ibn Taymiyah Kabir al-Sham. يتكلم في الفنون. He would speak in the different branches of knowledge. إلا أن في عقله شيئا. Which means, I'm going to translate that. Yeah, but it has a negative connotation. إلا أن في عقله شيئا. Except, so he'd speak in the different branches of knowledge, literally except that in his aql there was something. Meaning, it's a negative, it has negative connotations. Right? He said, إلا أن في عقله شيئا. And then obviously, because the Wahhabis work hard, so they've obviously put footnotes on the book. So in the footnotes, this guy writes, there's someone that writes, لا شك أن كلام ابن بطوطة انتقاص من قدر شيخ الإسلام لا يقبله الكثير من العلماء. He said, of course, what Ibn Batuta is saying here, of course, in trying to stab at supposed Shaykh-ul Islam, Ibn Taymiyah, then many of the scholars do not accept this. Anyway, so he continues, he says, وَكَانَ أَهْلُ دِمَشْقَ يُعَظِّمُونَهُ أَشَدَّ التَّعْظِيمِ. The people of Damascus would glorify him, and what a great scholar he is. And وَيُعَظِّمُونَهُ وَيَعِظُهُمْ عَلَى الْمِنْبَرِ. He would stand on the pulpit or sit and he would lecture. وتكلم مرة بأمر أنكره الفقهاء ورفعوه إلى الملك الناصر. He said at one particular point in time, he spoke about something and the people, they stood up against him. And because of that, they took him to Cairo, from Damascus to Cairo. So here, he actually mentions one of these issues that occurred. He says, okay, so here we are. He says, فَحَضَرْتُهُ يَوْمَ الْجُمُعَةِ. So I was present, he said, يوم الجمعة. وهو يعظ الناس على المنبر الجامع. And he was advising people, giving a lesson, okay, in the biggest masjid. وَيُذَكِّرُهُمْ. And he was reminding them about Allah and so on. فَكَانَ مِنْ جُمْلَةِ كَلَامِهِ أَنْ قَالَ. And among what he said was, إِنَّ اللَّهَ ينزل إلى السماء الدنيا كنزول هذا ونزل درجة من درجة المنبر. And so Ibn Taymiyah said that Allah descends just like my descent. And then he stepped down one step after minbar. And he said كنزول هذا, like this. فعارضه فقيه مالكي يعرف بابن الزهراء وأنكر ما تكلم به فقامت العامة إلى هذا الفقيه وضربوه بالأيدي والنعال ضربا كثيرا حتى سقطت عمامته. So here in this particular book, it's strange. If you read on, it's strange in the order in which the events occur, and it seems like it's been changed. Honestly, it seems like it's been changed because what the scholars that were citing Ibn Batuta's book mentioned after him was that Ibn Taymiyah was then beaten up. He was dragged and he was beaten bil aydi wal ni'al. He was slapped and punched and then even with shoes. Right? He was hit. And then it says, here it says that there was a person that stood up and tried to confront Ibn Taymiyah, but then everybody turned on this person and started hitting him. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there, because some narrate it as, no, it was Ibn Taymiyah that was beaten up. And then when he was beaten, his imamah fell off, and then they found that he was wearing a cap, a hat made of silk. It's haram. So then they gave him some more, and then they reported him to the Qadi and so on. Anyway, so the Wahhabiyyah, they say that this is not correct. This didn't actually happen. And immediately they pull out the fabricator, liar card on Ibn Batuta. Ibn Batuta at this time, he was maybe 23 or 24 years old. And he was very, very knowledgeable. They made him a Qadi in those other countries. Anyway, now, the thing is that they say, even some Sunni scholars have said that this scholar, Ibn Batuta, in terms of his lifespan, he couldn't have met Ibn Taymiyah when he went to Damascus because Ibn Taymiyah was in prison at the time, right? That's if you look purely to the dates, right? But the thing is that, we obviously don't want to say anything wrong. We don't want to make any mistakes any historical mistakes either. So we take that into consideration. We say, look, okay, fine. Okay, if that's the case, then. But at the same time, he wouldn't lie because he's a scholar. But then what happened is when further on into his journey, Ibn Batuta, a lot of his belongings were stolen, including his book. He was writing as he went along. It was stolen. And he was affected a lot by that. So then when he returned to his hometown in Morocco, it was requested from him to redo this matter. It was requested from him to write it again. So he's human. So if there are now discrepancies, and scholars did later on who reviewed his book, they found discrepancies in names. Because Really? He goes all out. He mentions every city he goes to, he says, this person was the Qadi there, this person was the Wali there, this person was, in charge of this and this. And he mentions names and who their grandfathers were and everything. But even the weather, yeah, exactly. And he mentions the history about the city and so with dates, a year here, a year there, you can imagine discrepancies, right? And some scholars actually found some discrepancies, fine, historical discrepancies. So that's understandable if you got a date wrong here and there, but why make up this issue? Anyway, we know that Ibn Taymiyah, we know what his history was, and we know that he was someone who very clearly said things that attributed, that necessitate that Allah would be attributed with human attributes or created attributes. So let's just give an example of some of the issues in which he went against the Muslims. So Abu Sa'id al-Ala'i, a scholar who is the Shaykh of al-Hafiz al-Iraaqi, he said, فَمِنْهَا, among the matters that Ibn Taymiyah went against the Islamic rules in are فَمِنْهَا مَا خَالَفَ فِيهَا الْإِجْمَاعِ وَمِنْهَا مَا خَالَفَ فِيهَا الرَّاجِحِ. Some of them, he went against the consensus of the Muslims, so in non-creedal issues now. He went against the consensus of the Muslim mujtahids, and in some of them, he went against the preponderated saying, the more reliable saying in the madhabs. He said, فَمِنْ ذَلِكَ يَمِينُ الطَّلَاقِ. قال بأنه لا يقع عند وقوع المحلوف عليه بل عليه فيها كفارة يمين. He said that in this case, when a person says to his wife, if you leave the house today, then you are divorced 3 times. So to make the divorce contingent upon something, what do we know that to be? That if she then does that on that day, according to the condition, then she would be divorced 3 times. As soon as she does it, divorce takes place. Ibn Taymiyah said, and he went against all of the Muslims in this, he said, لا يقع عند وقوع المحلوف عليه. He said that if she steps outside the house on that day, according to the condition, he said that the divorce doesn't occur. بل عليه فيها كفارة يمين. Instead, he has to pay an expiation. And she's not divorced. So imagine how many people took this and continued in their zina. وَلَمْ يَقُلْ قَبْلَهُ بِالْكَفَّارَةِ أَحَدٌ مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ الْبَتَّةَ. Nobody at all before him among the Muslims said this about the kaffara. Nobody. وَدَامَ إِفْتَاؤُهُ بِذَلِكَ زَمَانًا طَوِيلًا وَعَظُمَ الْخَطْبِ. And he continued to teach this for a long time, and this caused many problems. ووقع في تقليده جم غفير من العوام العام البلاء. And many people among the laymen followed him in this. They'd come to ask him, and he'd say, no, just kafara, he's paying expiation. وقال أيضا, he also said, وأن طلاق الحائض لا يقع. We know that if a woman is menstruating and she is divorced by her husband, then the divorce occurs. Whether it was sinful for him to do that or not is a different matter, right? That's a different matter. But the divorce occurs. He said it doesn't occur. And he went against the Muslims in this. وكذلك الطلاق في طهر جامع فيه زوجته. Likewise, he said that the divorce doesn't occur if a husband has had intercourse with his wife and divorces her in that period of purity. He said the divorce doesn't occur. Madness. All the scholars know. Everyone knows that occurs. وقال إن الطلاق الثلاثة يرد إلى واحدة. He said, and if a person says to his wife, quote, you are divorced 3 times, end quote. If he says that, he said it only counts as 1. Bizarre. Not if, he's not saying if a person says to his wife, you are divorced, you are divorced, you are divorced. He's not saying that. Because here it has the potential that the second and the third would be emphasizes, right? They would emphasize this one. Yeah, some scholars said that. As for someone to say to his wife, quote, "You are divorced 3 times," end quote. 3 times is 3, that's it. So he said it's 1. So Taqiyy-ud-Deen or Abu Sa'id al-Ala'i, he said, وَكَانَ قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ قد نقل إجماع المسلمين في هذه المسألة على خلاف ذلك وأن من خالفه فقد كفر. And Ibn Taymiyah himself before this had said that whoever goes against this issue, which he actually did, he went against this issue. He had said previously, whoever goes against this has gone against the Muslim consensus and is a kafir. Ibn Taymiyah said that himself. And then he went against it. ثم إنه أفتى بخلافه وأوقع خلقا كثيرا من الناس فيه. And then he gave a fatwa against it, and he made many people خلقا كثيرا, a lot of people fell into this issue. وقال إن الحائض تطوف في البيت من غير كفارة وهو مباح لها. He said that if a woman is menstruating, then she can go and make Tawaf. That it's permissible for her to make Tawaf. We know that, these are issues now that, you need to be well tuned in with fiqh. A person cannot make a Tawaf around the Kaaba if they don't have wudu. Because the Prophet ﷺ said that a Tawaf is like a salah, the prayer you need wudu, except that you can talk during Tawaf. So Ibn Taymiyah, so the scholar said that a menstruating woman can't do that because she can't make wudu, right? So Ibn Taymiyah said, no, she can. وقال إن المكوس حلال لمن أقطعها. That being a governor and charging people with tax, he said whoever takes the tax as a governor and so on, he said this is permissible. He said this is permissible. وقال وإذا أخذت من التجار أجزأتهم عن الزكاة وإن لم تكن باسم الزكاة ولا على أصلها. That if tax is taken from traders as part of their trade, then this counts as zakat for the traders, even if they don't have the intention of zakat, which is bizarre. So he said this is zakat. So these are among the things he said. وقال إن المائعات لا تنجس بموت الفأرة ونحوها فيها. That if there are liquids other than water, let's say, liquids, however large they are, we know that if a rat or something, a dead rat or a mouse, falls into one of these items, into these liquids, all of it becomes najis, like zaytun, olive oil, right? That becomes najis. Ibn Taymiyah said, no, it doesn't become najis. وقال إن الصلاة إذا تركت عمدا لا يشرع قضاؤها. And you see some of them saying, some of the Wahhabis saying this. They say that, what he said that if you miss an obligatory prayer on purpose, you don't have to make it up. وقال إن الجنب يصلي تطوعه بالليل بالتيمم ولا يؤخره إلى أن يغتسل عند الفجر وإن كان بالبلد. Some of these I won't translate because they require a lot of explanation. قال وقد رأيت من يفعل ذلك ممن قلده فمنعته منه. وسئل عن رجل قدم فراشا لأمير فتجنب بالليل في السفر ويخاف إن يغتسل عند الفجر أن يتهمه أستاذه بغلمانه فأفتاه بصلاة الصبح بالتيمم وهو قادر على الغسل. Okay, this one. وسئل عن شرط الواقف فقال غير معتبر بالكلية. You know that if you have a house and you say, I restrict the use of this house for the sake of Allah for the Shafi'is, then only the Shafi'is can live in it, right? And the Hanafis won't be allowed to go and live in it. Or if he says, وقفت هذا لله لحفظة القرآن, that I have restricted the use of this house specifically by waqf for those that are memorizing the Quran. So those who are not memorizing the Quran cannot. So Ibn Taymiyah said, لا ليس معتبرا بالكلية. He said, this doesn't. He said, no, this doesn't matter. This is fine. He said, بل الواقف على الشافعية يصرف إلى الحنفية. That's something that is specific for the Shafi'is. Like for example, the use of this. If it's specific for the Shafi'is by waqf, then the Hanafis can use it too. Really. وعلى الفقهاء يصرف إلى الصوفية. So he said if somebody says that this cup or this house can only be used by the fuqaha, the scholars who teach fiqh, then it's okay for the Sufis to use it as well, who don't really teach fiqh, they teach you like, to recite La ilaha illallah and so on. Anyway, on and on and on and on and on. Subhanallah, it keeps going. The last thing that I will read is, and he continued, Abu Sa'id al-Ala'i, he said, وصرح في بعض تصانيفه, and he explicitly said in some of his authorings, بأن الله تعالى بقدر العرش, that Allah, he is the size of the arsh, لا أكبر منه, not bigger than it, ولا أصغر, and not smaller. تعالى الله عن ذلك, Allah is exalted from being like that. وصنف جزءا في أن علم الله لا يتعلق بما لا يتناهى كنعيم أهل الجنة. And he also authored a small treatise in which he claimed that the knowledge of Allah does not relate to what does not end. We know it does. Like the endowments upon the people of paradise, like the pleasures of the people of paradise, because they don't end. Ibn Taymiyah claimed that, well, Allah doesn't know that. Allah doesn't have knowledge of that. This is what some of the Mu'tazila said. Okay. And the last thing that I will read today is what his student al-Dhahabi said. Al-Dhahabi, who we know to be also amongst the Mujassimah. Al-Dhahabi, he was a person who was a hafiz. Remember, Islamically, to acquire a rank in scholarship, a person, it's not a prerequisite that a person is pious. Like for example, for a person to be considered a hafiz, what are the conditions to memorize 100,000 hadith, right? So even if someone who's a non-Muslim memorizes 100,000 hadith, we'd call him al-hafiz, but we wouldn't pay any attention to what he's saying. He's just talking, no, we don't listen to you because you're not a Muslim. Like, what are you going to be using? What did you memorize 100,000 hadith for? And you're still not a Muslim? Oh, something wrong there, you know? Someone memorizes the Quran, we'd say, oh, he memorized the Quran. We're not going to be like reality now, are we? If a non-Muslim memorizes the Quran, we might not call him hafiz, right? But we're going to say, yeah, he memorized the Quran. He might have done it properly, with properly articulated letters. Likewise, someone might there might be a genius, and they might memorize all of these things, right? And they might reach a very high level at which they could deduce judgments. They could deduce judgments. They could say, oh, intellectually they could deduce judgments from the Quran, from the Hadith, but we wouldn't obviously take by them, right? So, al-Dhahabi being a mujassim, being someone who attributed created attributes to Allah, that doesn't stop him from being a hafiz, right? So al-hafiz al-Dhahabi, but we don't use al-Dhahabi. We have our own huffaz. But anyway, look what he said about Ibn Taymiyah, his teacher. He said, وقد تعبت في وزنه وفتشه حتى مللت في سنين متطاولة. That I have watched Ibn Taymiyah for years and I am exhausted. ومللت, and I've become bored, right? After many long years. فما وجدت أخره بين أهل مصر والشام. That I haven't seen anything. Okay, I'm going to do this in Arabic. He said, وَازْدَرُوا بِهِ وَكَذَّبُوهُ وَكَفَّرُوهُ. He said, the only reason that I've seen that the people of Egypt and the Levant, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, part of Iraq, Turkey, and Egypt, the reason why I have seen these people belittle him and belie him and call him a kafir is because he is someone who is arrogant. وَفِيهِ الْعُجُبُ, and he thinks a lot of himself. وَفَرْطُ الْغَرَامِ فِي رِئَاسَةِ الْمَشْيَخَةِ, and he loves to have control. He loves authority and power. And al-izdirā' bil-kibar, and he sees the other great scholars as nothing. فَانظُرْ كَيْفَ وَبَالُ الدَّعَاوَى وَمَحَبَّةُ الظُّهُورِ. So look, O person, look, O reader, into where wanting attention leads you. نَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ الْمُسَامَحَةَ. We ask Allah to pardon us, he says. And he wrote a whole thing against him, advising Ibn Taymiyah. So Ibn Taymiyah, when we say that he really was someone in history who had a big effect, someone infamous who had an effect on those in the future. Look, how far are we now? 600 or 700 years later, more, 800 years later, and still now they are calling him Shaykh-ul Islam. One of the scholars, a scholar from Bukhara, a Bukhari scholar, not al-Bukhari, he said, "Man samma Ibn Taymiyah Shaykh-ul Islam, fahuwa kafir." He said, whoever calls Ibn Taymiyah Shaykh-ul Islam after knowing what Ibn Taymiyah believes, and whoever calls him Shaykh-ul Islam, which is actually a title of recognition, an honorary title, the Shaykh-ul Islam, said this person is a kafir. How would they call Ibn Taymiyah that? But remember, this is if they know about his teachings, if they know about all these things. Otherwise, someone might call him Shaykh-ul Islam, and then we say, what about this guy? Don't you know this? And he said, no, I didn't know that he believed all these things. Fine. So you don't get kufr. That's obvious, right? It's obvious. Like some of the scholars said about him, they praised Ibn Taymiyah because they heard that he was spreading Islamic knowledge. So they praised him. We would praise someone if we heard that they're spreading Islamic knowledge, that they're teaching the children, that they're teaching, for example, elderly people, they're authoring books. We praise them. Later on we find out that, oh, wait a second, this person's, not guided or something like that. So yeah. So there is good reason to warn against Ibn Taymiyah. Subhanallah, I was going to read this as well, but there's another occasion where he said Allah sits and people jumped on him. People jumped on him, they started beating him up. But anyway, subhanallah, he was moved. He was degraded so much by the scholars. And someone might say, well, if he was an apostate, then in those lands with those rules, why didn't they just get rid of him? Right? That's because he had a large following. He had a very large following at that time even. When he died, when he actually died, he wasn't killed. When he died, they washed him, and then the water with which they washed him, they drank it for what they claim tabarruk. They drank it because they believed they had blessings in it. Ibn Kathir mentioned this. And later on then, people of that kind started to say that you can't make tabarruk. Nowadays, the Wahhabis say you can make tabarruk. Nowadays, they say you can make tabarruk. I've debated some as well. They say, yeah, you can make tabarruk. Because the proofs are so clear. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's son said that Imam Ahmad used to do tabarruk with the hair of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. So they say you can make tabarruk. But now their argument is, but how can you prove the hair of the Prophet that you've got is real? That's their argument. If it's not one thing, it's the other, isn't it? Right? So that's their argument. Say, bring us your chains. We want to check your chains. We don't need to show them our chains of narration. Why? Because they're going to check our chains of narration and say, he was misguided. What good is that going to do to anybody? If you're guided, mashallah. But that's what they say. They say, well, there are no chains nowadays, or there are no proofs. And it's unfortunate that some people who attribute themselves to Ahl Sunnah have authored books in the past saying that they don't believe that there are any chains. Well, that's their problem, isn't it? If they were never lucky enough to be given or trusted enough to be given a hair of the Prophet ﷺ with the chain, because everyone gets the chain when they are given a hair. They are given the chain that is taken from this person, like this. So this person, if they didn't see that, subhanAllah, now their authorings are being used by the Wahhabis to say, look, even this person who was a Sunni speaker, let's say, not a scholar. There's a person called, actually I won't mention his name. He's not a scholar, but lived maybe 40 or 50 years ago. He wrote a book about the blessed items. And mashallah, okay. Anyway, so are there any questions about anything that was mentioned today?
Did you say al-Dhahabi was keeping Taymiyyah a student
Yeah.
and said those things against him?
Yeah, he did. He advised him because he saw that he was really arrogant. He wrote a small book. It's actually printed. And he advised him, said, look, you should do this, you should do that. Don't be so arrogant, don't be so this and that. But he shared his belief, though. He shared his belief in many things. Many things. Okay? We'll stop here then, inshallah. Let's say La ilaha illallah and as-salah ala nabi. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم